We have three more of our stakeholders with us for our final panel of the day. We have with us Sonny Fanelli, who's the Director of Rates and Regulatory Affairs for FirstEnergy. We have Kerry Stroup, who is with us today from PJM Interconnection. And we have Maureen Willis, Senior Regulatory Counsel, Office of the Ohio Consumers Council. Who is going first? Sonny, I think you're up in the deck first. Okay. Yeah. Thank you again, all of you, for being here. We appreciate it greatly.
Hi, good afternoon. Appreciate the opportunity to be here, Mr. Chairman, commissioners, members of staff. Pleased to be on this panel with my fellow panelists talking about rate making. I'm Sonny Fanelli. I'm in the Rates and Regulatory Affairs group at FirstEnergy. I'm here on behalf of our three Ohio operating companies, Ohio Edison Company, the Cleveland Electric Illuminating Company, and the Toledo Edison Company. And as we look forward towards transitioning to a more modern grid, we recognize the importance that rate making plays, the important role that rate making plays in that process. And so, in our view, at a high level, we see a couple of sort of overarching goals in terms of establishing a successful rate making construct. First, to us, from a customer perspective, of course, we want to make sure that these investments are being evaluated and have benefits, produce benefits to customers, and that the amounts that they're paying for these investments are fair and reasonable. That's an important prong for us. And then from a utility perspective, looking at it financially, we want to make sure that we are receiving full and timely recovery of our costs, and to the extent we can minimize the lag between when we're making the investments and when the dollars are recovered from customers. So we see it as a balance between the customer interest and the utility interest. And the other factor we feel is important at this stage is when we look across the different utilities in the state, recognizing where each utility is with respect to its progress on grid modernization investment, as well as its retail rate plans that are in effect currently. And so for us, as we sit here today, the FirstEnergy companies, from an investment standpoint, we do have a pilot program. We feel a successful pilot program in our Cleveland Electric Illuminating Company territory, which I'll talk about here more briefly shortly. And we've also dedicated a lot of time and resources to thinking about and developing plans for future, broader, larger scale grid modernization investments. So I feel we do have some significant experience there. From a rate perspective, a rate-making perspective, we have currently, as part of our electric security plan in place through May of 2024, a rider. For us, it's rider AMI. That's the acronym we use. And that rider is in place to recover the costs associated with approved grid modernization investments. So that rider is in effect. It does employ a traditional cost of service calculation. And so it's in place now. And we feel that it makes sense for customers, and I'll try to elaborate on that here shortly. We feel it provides a good balance of the customer interest and the utility interest the way this rider is constructed. That being said, we also feel like the rider that we have can be implemented in conjunction with other measures or controls to help ensure that customers are receiving benefits for the investments. So we see it as a package that way between the mechanism that we have in place, our rider AMI, in conjunction with some additional measures, which I hope to elaborate on here shortly. So just briefly to provide a little bit more color on our experience with grid modernization investment, our pilot program in our Cleveland territory has been in effect for a number of years. It originated out of a grant from the Department of Energy. That was approved in 2011. So within this pilot, we have installed 34,000 smart meters to customers. We also have installed some smart grid infrastructure, distribution automation, and volt-var control on 34 circuits. And it's been a really good learning opportunity for us. We've had a chance to get some feedback from our customers who've participated in that, more on the metering and time of use rate options that were available. But also from an infrastructure perspective, we continue to track and monitor the performance of these assets. And I'm here to say we're proud of the performance that we've seen. We track the reliability in that service territory. We report on that annually, and we've seen significant improvement in the frequency and duration of outages in that area. So that's been a really good learning opportunity for us. We got some significant lessons learned from that particular pilot program, and we've been able to leverage that to continue our thinking as we're thinking about sort of the next step and next phase of grid modernization investments. So we have developed and put forward a longer-term grid modernization business plan looking out over 8 to 15 years, more larger, broader investment or deployment of these smart grid technologies. That, of course, is pending the outcome of this proceeding here. But based on the time that we spent developing that case, our experience in the pilot, our participation in the first 2 rounds of Power Forward, and just our general ongoing interactions with customers and other stakeholders in the industry, we feel there's an opportunity, and where our focus is right now from an investment standpoint is to modernize our distribution platform. We feel there's a good opportunity there to provide benefits to customers in terms of improved reliability and to also help put our system in a better position to enable future grid modernization investment. The types of work I'm talking about when I say platform modernization are things that are creating alternate paths for power to flow and improving the visibility that our system operators have so they can have better visibility into what's going on in the conditions of the system. So that's where we're at from an investment perspective. Now, tying this back into the rate making to provide a little bit more color on the rider that we have approved and in effect. This particular rider, as I said, rider AMI, it's the rider we have used historically to recover the cost associated with the smart grid pilot in CEI, and it's the rider we intend to seek to recover costs under associated with any approved grid modernization investments. And the way that it works mechanically, it is a traditional cost of service type calculation, so it includes a return on and of investment and associated operating expenses and taxes. And it's updated on a quarterly basis, and so we project out for the upcoming quarter, set the rate based on our projected costs, and then 3 months later we'll come back, reconcile it to actuals, and project out for the subsequent quarter. And we continue that process every quarter, and then consistent with the practice we've utilized for the past number of years, at the end of the year we'll submit for an annual audit looking back at the prior year's costs. So that is mechanically how the rider works, and I feel it is what's in effect under our ESP through May of 2024, but we feel it makes sense, particularly given where we're at with our investment in grid modernization infrastructure. We feel it provides benefits both to customers and to the utility, and first and foremost, the timing aspect of it, given that it's updated on a quarterly basis, that helps the utility out, of course, because we have more timely recovery of our costs, and so we're able to invest maybe in a more efficient manner than otherwise could occur, and we feel that benefits customers. Also, what the timing does is ensures that customers are paying our costs and only our costs of the investment. So you're not going to have a significant lag based on the riders set up now that could maybe have a mismatch between the costs that are being incurred by the utility and the costs that are being recovered from the customer, because we're looking at it every 3 months and making sure that those are in sync. Other benefits, to the extent that the utilities accrue some operational savings associated with these investments, those savings we would net against the costs that we're recovering through the rider. So those would be flowed back through to customers on a timely basis. And as I mentioned, we still have the annual review of the costs. So when we look at the mechanism that's in place, we feel it does a good job of trying to go a long way towards achieving the goals of a successful rate-making construct that I mentioned earlier. So we recognize, though, that there are performance-based rate-making concepts out there. I know a lot of discussion about that. And, from our perspective, I think in general, we don't necessarily disagree with those concepts. A lot of it's driven at making sure that customers are seeing value for their investments. We feel that's important. We agree with that. And it's not, in our view, we don't see it as a new concept necessarily, performance-based regulation. We do a lot of tracking and reporting now for reliability, various operational metrics like worst performing circuits. We track the number of behind the meter generators, and also we solicit feedback via customer surveys on a routine basis, and that's very helpful to us. These are all tools that exist today that we feel are important and are effective in creating a successful regulatory construct. And so as we look towards grid modernization, moving forward on grid modernization, we feel it makes sense to have some of these tools in the toolkit going forward and apply those to grid modernization investment. So from that standpoint, conceptually, performance-based concepts make sense to us. What gives us a little bit of pause, though, it would be introducing or moving forward now on a concept or a construct whereby it could potentially impede progress in terms of utility investment, and particularly in the situation we find ourselves in where we're really focused on getting going and modernizing this distribution platform. So when I mention that, an example that comes to mind would potentially be a situation where the amount that we are allowed to recover for an investment, once it's already been improved and placed in service, particularly an investment in our core distribution platform, if that's subject to some volatility or potential adjustment based on the performance of the asset, we're a little concerned that that could have some adverse impacts from a risk perspective. You know, if we look at our investors may see that as a riskier investment, potentially could drive up our costs of capital, and those higher costs of capital potentially would flow through our rider. So we would be cautious about proceeding forward with something like that right away. That being said, from a performance metric standpoint, again, we think a lot of that makes sense. I mean, these investments are going to be new for us. I said we have a pilot, but you know, as we move forward, it's going to be new for us, new for our customers. It makes a lot of sense, we feel, to track the performance to make sure that the desired outcomes are being achieved and that customers are getting the benefits. So a few areas that come to mind, I know that have been mentioned here already, of potential areas of metrics: reliability, of course, safety, high priority. A lot of what we'd be looking to do would potentially have some safety benefits for our customers. We would also look at customer satisfaction. We want to make sure we continue to hear from our customers what they think about these investments, if they are perceiving benefits from them. And a final area, we sort of view it as readiness. You know, I mentioned we've got some platform modernization work to do, some sort of measure that looks at the status of our system currently versus where it would be once the platform has been modernized to be in a better position to enable future grid modernization. Some sort of measure that takes into consideration or account that that progress has been made may be something that is helpful to monitor as well. Other factors I would just mention for consideration or offer for your consideration in the context of setting performance metrics would be maybe an obvious one to maybe be as clear and objective as we can. I think that helps everybody, of course, just having the clarity. It'll eliminate some of the ambiguity or subjectivity that could occur. Another consideration that comes to mind is there may be circumstances outside of the utilities control that influence or have an impact on the performance of these investments. And so we feel it would be helpful to take that into consideration in some form so that there's not necessarily a penalty or reward associated with performance of an investment if what drove the performance is outside of the utilities control. Also, I reiterate, continue to receive feedback from our customers. That's an important tenet to us as we look towards potentially establishing some metrics. So while we don't necessarily, or while we would caution moving forward at this point with a construct that would create additional risk for the utility with a reward penalty type of a setup, particularly with these grid modernization platform investments, we do feel it's important to track the performance, and then we can take the lessons learned and the knowledge gained from that evaluation, the tracking of that performance, and apply that to the next round or the next phase of investment. So process-wise, the way that we're sort of thinking about it is the utility makes a request to seek approval to implement certain investments. That would follow the normal regulatory process. Other parties would have the opportunity to intervene and weigh in on the pros and cons. A big component of that evaluation we foresee as being benefits to customers. A decision then would be made based on the best available information at the time on the record in the case, whether to proceed with the investments or not, and in which manner. And then we would feel like at that point, the utility should have some relative certainty about the framework for which investments should be made and the recovery mechanism that those costs would run through. That would allow us to start moving forward and investing in an efficient manner. And then in parallel with that, we can start to track the performance to see how these assets are performing, whether they are meeting the intended objectives or not. We can take that information collectively, not only the utilities, other parties, and evaluate it and help us determine what makes sense going forward for the next phase so that we are continuing to sort of move forward in an incremental or progressive fashion, and hopefully we're getting smarter each step of the way. So that's generally how we sort of see these pieces fitting together. as we look at a successful rate-making construct to implement grid modernization. So we feel that there's a lot of these tools and mechanisms in place through the existing commission rules now and through our electric security plan, and there could be additional measures that are sort of implemented in conjunction with that to really help balance out the interests of customers and the companies and all stakeholders and help us achieve what we feel are the intended goals of a successful rate-making construct as we move forward on grid modernization. So those are my prepared remarks. I appreciate your time and look forward to more discussion. Thank you.
Sonny, thank you very much. Maureen?
Thank you. Chairman Hawk, Commissioners, I want to thank you for the opportunity and honor to present the residential consumer perspectives on rate making in this wide-ranging and informational discussion of Power Forward. We appreciate the kind invitation. I'm appearing today on behalf of the Ohio Consumers Counsel. And for you, those of you who may not know, the Consumers Counsel is a representative of nearly 4 million residential customers receiving utility service in Ohio. We were formed in 1976 and are governed by Chapter 4911 of the Revised Code. Now, as you've previously heard throughout the months and months of Power Forward. Power Forward involves both non-competitive components of service and competitive components of service. The non-competitive components of service are what has been referred to as behind-the-meter technologies, and those were discussed by my colleague at OCC, Dan Shields. So I promise I will not wander or drift off into that area with the chairman's warning. I will direct my presentation instead to how to treat monopoly components of grid modernization. And I have to tell you that when I sat and listened to Mr. Fanelli's, my colleague's, presentation, I agreed 100% with his presentation for the first 30 seconds. I think he made some valid points about what customers want and what customers need. They need reliable, reasonably priced service. And it appears to me that that was the lead-off of Mr. Fanelli's remarks. But after that, it got a little bit contentious from OCC's perspective. But on this slide here, we present the principles for monopoly service for grid modernization that will provide both value and protect customers at the same time. The principles that we support center on affordability, reliability, and safety for customers. We support, unlike Mr. Fanelli, we support the traditional regulatory model to provide consumers value and protect them. And by the traditional model, we're referring to the long-standing rate-making standards that are contained and govern distribution service provided by electric distribution utilities in Chapter 4909. Alternatively, for the non-utility behind-the-meter service, we support the regulatory model that's provided by a competitive market, where markets, and not regulation, fuel innovation, opportunities, and low prices for customers. This slide presents our view of the elements in traditional rate-making model that we believe will ensure value to customers and at the same time protect customers with regard to distribution grid investment. These standards are found in Ohio law and in Ohio precedent. These standards include prudence, ordinary and necessary, the test period concept, and used and useful. These standards avoid pre-approving utility investment because pre-approval unreasonably shifts the risk to customers where it should belong with the utility. This regulatory model will provide value to customers for grid modernization and allows for adequate investment in technology. We think it's very important for the Commission to keep in mind that there is a duty to serve customers. By virtue of a utility being a public entity, it has a duty to provide necessary and reasonable service to all, and that service must be reliable and must be provided on a non-discriminatory basis. The regulatory model that we recommend for grid investment centers upon the principle of prudence. Prudence focuses on what a reasonable person would have done in light of the circumstances known at that time. There is no hindsight in the prudence review. The duty is on the utility to prove prudence. It is not a duty that's placed on other parties to show imprudence. The Commission should be very familiar with the concept of prudence. In fact, when I think about my regulatory career over the last 25 years, I can recall being in cases with perhaps some of you, in fact, Commissioner Conway, with respect to looking at prudence on issues like the Zimmer nuclear power plant and the Perry nuclear power plant cost overruns. Prudence was a big element of those reviews, and that prudence standard helped protect customers from paying for unnecessary investment and expenses that were not just and reasonable. Another part of the rate-making model that we are recommending for utility grid investment includes the concept of used and useful. This standard applies to investment. The investment must be used and useful to consumers. Another important element of the used and useful standard is that the investment must be made at date certain. And date certain is part of the test year concept. That concept, that period, the date certain and the test period are chosen by the utility, completely under the utility's control. The rate-making model that we recommend for utility investment in the grid also uses the standards of ordinary and necessary. The expenses incurred must be ordinary and necessary to provide service, and they must occur within a discrete time frame called the test period, again, chosen by the utility. We would caution the Commission that it should avoid overusing deferral accounting, because deferral accounting undermines the test year concepts and the date certain principles which provide protection to consumers. It's important to avoid using alternative rate making of ESPs for distribution investment, as it provides no value and does not protect customers. Here is where my colleague Sonny and I depart. Sonny's presentation included remarks that the riders are working and that the ESP situation, the ESP is the regulatory model. We vehemently disagree with that. The problem with the ESP is there are multiple problems with the ESP. First of all, there's the issue of unfair bargaining. First that really was raised before the Commission was raised by a Commissioner, Cheryl Roberto, in her concurrence and dissenting opinion in the FirstEnergy electric security plan place. She noted that the utilities, because the utilities have the ability to withdraw from an electric security plan when the Commission modifies the plan, that creates an uneven playing field. And that's an uneven playing field not only for the parties participating in the ESP, but I believe it's also an uneven playing field with the Commission. Secondly, the problem with using the electric security plan as the rate-making methodology is it encourages single-issue rate-making with cherry-picking, with the utility being able to cherry-pick what expenses it seeks. Compare that to the traditional rate-making model, which we support, where all expenses and all revenues are looked at, and there can be a balancing of expenses and revenues. Another problem that exists with using the ESP as the regulatory model is that it allows utilities to charge customers for excessive profits. Utilities cannot charge customers for significantly excessive profits under the ESP, and this does not provide adequate protection. Compare that to the standard for traditional rate making. Under traditional rate making, utilities are entitled to an opportunity to earn a fair and reasonable rate of return, a much more protective standard for the customers who pay utility rates. Another issue that we find in the electric security plan regulatory model is that it promotes subsidy after subsidy. Since 2000, under earlier plans and the electric security plans, customers have paid $14 billion from the period of 2000 through 2017 in subsidies. We also estimate that customers will pay another $1.2 billion through ESP plans from the period of 2017 through 2023. The solution to the problems caused by using the electric security plan as a regulatory model, HB 247. Get rid of ESPs. It is crucial, no matter what rate-making model is used for grid modernization, that the model should enable refunds for improper, imprudent, or unlawful utility charges. The traditional rate-making model that we recommend to address grid modernization does not allow single-issue rate-making. Single-issue rate-making is unique to the electric security plan provisions. This slide shows the number of riders that customers currently pay by utility in Ohio. It's too many. This slide does not even include the additional riders that are being proposed in the electric security plans by Duke and AEP. Duke has a proposal for 4 additional riders on top of the 21 that it already has, and AEP has an additional 6 riders proposed on top of its 24. Sorry, Sonny, but if AEP gets approval of its riders, it will move to the top of the chart, displacing FE. In the discussion of Power Forward, it's very important for the Commission to focus on how much customers should pay for grid modernization. But customers are already paying for grid modernization initiative through 14 current riders that are shown on this slide. And there's more grid modernization riders to come. As I indicated, AEP has 4 of their 6 riders that they're seeking to have the PUCO authorize are grid smart or grid modernization riders. They're known as the Renewable Generation Rider, the Smart City Rider, the Power Forward Rider, and the Plug-in Vehicle Rider. Duke's has two of their 4 riders relate to grid modernization. Those include the Power Forward Rider and the Electric Service Reliability Rider. I want to mention 2 comments concerning this slide and the riders that customers already pay for grid modernization. As you can see, there is no uniformity in these charges. That creates a problem with transparency, and it also creates a problem for regulators as well as other parties to audit and check and make sure that expenses associated with grid modernization are not being double collected. And the second comment that I want to make is on the fundamental issue, and I believe it was raised earlier by the gentleman from ENGIE that led off the initiation of the Phase 3 Power Forward discussion. And that question is more investment in the grid really necessary? Or do we need to just rethink about how the existing grid can be used more efficiently? As part of the Power Forward discussions, the PUCO has been looking at performance-based regulation. If performance-based regulation is to be used to incent grid modernization investment by utilities, the PUCO must look at performance-based regulation in the context of traditional regulation, not as part of an alternative regulation model such as an electric security plan. Performance-based regulation is a fit for traditional regulation and has been used in the past by the PUCO. We would agree with the Regulatory Assistance Project conclusions that the Commission has jurisdiction to use performance-based regulation. In fact, the Commission has used examples or models of performance-based regulation in the past. What comes to mind is using the rate of return to adjust the rate of return within the staff's range to the high end for superior performance and to the low end for subpar performance. Another example of performance-based regulation that the Commission has used is with the shared savings or the profits that are associated with energy efficiency. In this regard, we think it's important that the shared savings in particular, that there be a cap on the amount the customers pay. A cap protects customers from paying too much, in this case for energy efficiency. And another point on the shared savings mechanism is that customers should not, the paying of the utility profit should not start at the point that the utility meets the statutory mandate, that rather they should occur after the statutory mandate is met. And that's similar to the point that's raised in this slide, that you should reward utilities for extraordinary efforts only. The final point on this slide that I want to raise is that the Commission should avoid interfering with competitive markets, and the utility, it should avoid those efforts, and it should prevent the utility from venturing into markets that are funded by captive customers. And this slide speaks to the additional criteria the Commission should use if performance-based regulation is pursued. Again, these should only be used under traditional rate-making model and not under an alternative regulatory approach such as the ESPs. The performance criteria that we recommend place importance on using well-defined criteria that is verifiable and quantifiable. We would not recommend qualitative metrics. We also note that there should be symmetry in the incentives and penalties associated with any performance-based regulation. And finally, we do recommend that there be rate or revenue caps to protect customers in the event the Commission determines performance-based regulation is recommended. We would note that the criteria that we have presented for the Commission are not dissimilar to those that were espoused in the regulatory assistant project recommendations that were presented as part of the earlier panel discussions. In conclusion, to drive home if there's any question, OCC's primary recommendation on the rate-making treatment for grid investment. For grid investment pertaining to monopoly distribution services, we recommend the long-standing traditional regulation for value and to protect consumers. On the other hand, for grid investment that is considered non-utility investment, we recommend competitive markets to produce value for customers and fuel innovation and lower prices. Thank you.
Thank you, Maureen. Kerry?
Well, now I understand why Kristen put me between Sonny and Maureen. Let me begin by conveying Denise Foster's regrets that she couldn't be here today due to inclement weather in Philadelphia, having canceled a lot of flights. And she appreciates having been invited to participate in the Power Forward discussions. And it's my pleasure to fill in for her. As you all know, I'm based here in Columbus as a manager of state government policy for PJM. Now, some may think it a bit presumptuous for PJM to be on a retail rate-making panel. Rest assured, we're not getting into the business of retail rate making. Nevertheless, as DER, and I'll call it DER for short if I may, as DER proliferates and policy at the federal and state level evolves to enable the realization of its benefits, rate making questions necessarily arise. From PJM's perspective, those rate making questions are closely tied to the incentives that retail rates could provide for DER actions that maintain or enhance bulk power system reliability. And that reliability connection is the basis for PJM's deep interest in DER, whether connected at the distribution system level or behind the meter. Going forward, as PJM continues its efforts to enhance opportunities for DER to complement its operations, markets, and planning outcomes, there'll be many opportunities to collaborate with forward-looking retail regulators, and in that regard, Chairman Hawk and Commissioners, PJM commends the Commission's foresight and tenacity in putting together the Power Forward initiative. So before I turn to the matter of retail distribution rates, please allow me to reset the context for PJM's interest in DER and lay a foundation for the retail rate focus that I'll come to near the end of the presentation. DER and BTM storage is focused in the state or retail arena, almost by definition, but it's increasing in its importance to the wholesale power markets that PJM operates, as well as the regional transmission expansion planning process that we perform. PJM, of course, is the regional transmission organization responsible for reliable operation of the 13th state and District of Columbia region of the United States, including all of Ohio. We maintain reliability through wholesale markets, system operations, and transmission system planning. We use markets to ensure that supply and demand remain in balance in real time and cost effectively. And we also use markets to incentivize investment to maintain resources and to build new resources to ensure that the supply-demand balance will continue to be achieved in the future. We use system planning to ensure that power can flow from all the supply resources, whether in or outside PJM, to the load centers across our region. Everyone knows we're not responsible for the delivery of power down to the individual retail customers. That, of course, is the purview of retail markets and the distribution system. So why is it that we care about resources located at the distribution level? Resources predominantly there for the benefit of the distribution system or individual retail customers. Well, it's because we're charged with ensuring reliability of the regional grid at the most efficient cost. Of course, we wish to avoid any negative reliability implications of distribution-level resources, but conversely, we believe the manner in which distribution-level resources are deployed and used could maximize their value for the purpose of bolstering bulk power system reliability and the efficiency of wholesale markets. As DER policies get shaped, from an RTO's perspective, it's important to consider three things. First, the visibility of location and knowledge of the capability of the distributed energy resources. Secondly, our ability to measure and forecast the operational performance of those resources. And third, the potential to incentivize the reliability-related performances of the resources through market signals. And of course, that's the element that's implicated in retail distribution rate making. So let's start with visibility. Today, PJM has limited visibility into the operation of DERs. We know about DER that's brought into the wholesale, or in the PJM markets, I should say, in the form of demand response or generation or storage. But we only may have locational awareness of DER that does not participate in the wholesale markets. For many years, of course, PJM has focused on the reliability-driven need for situational awareness of its high-voltage power system. But with the proliferation of DERs, we now need to consider what it means to have situational awareness regarding the operation of those DERs and how the distribution system will interplay with the transmission system. And that situational awareness starts with knowledge of the existence of resources, where they're located and what their operational capabilities are. I think we're all aware and can think back to what happened in the late summer of 2013. And during the hot weather experience that summer, PJM was forced to shed a limited amount of load in the Pigeon River area in southwestern Michigan, where for 2 days we had to shed load. Now on the third day, although system conditions were the same, we became aware of an operation behind the meter coordinated by the EDC of a dispatchable distributed DER. I'll call it a DER. And with the cooperation of that electric distribution company, we were able to have the energy from that resource dispatched and prevent the load shedding for that third day. Now, that was all done on a voluntary basis. There was no compensation provided for it. We were grateful, thankful for the EDC to have done that. In the future, there may arise a time with regulatory reform at the federal level that there could be compensation so awarded, but we weren't there then and we're not there now. The need for situational awareness and ability to coordinate the operation of dispatchable DERs will likely become more important over time, of course, as the number of DERs proliferate. Now, let's consider what PJM knows today about the location and capability of DERs, and that visibility is limited. We, of course, are aware of the 1.2 gigawatts of primarily of demand response DERs that participate in our market. But on the other hand, there are a lot of distributed energy resources in our footprint, about 3.7 gigawatts as we now assess the situation, that are not registered and they don't interact with our market. These are ones of which we have a general awareness of their location, but certainly not of their operating characteristics. We know about them through renewable resources that are registered in our GATS, or Generation Attribute Tracking System, for REC transfer purposes, and also ones that our research in collaboration, I should say, with the Ohio Commission, significantly, some other commissions in our footprint, as well as research into the EIA data that's available. Regarding what is out there, is dispatchable, and this is really now known by our system operators through a tool that we've developed, that being the Dispatch Interactive Map application, so that hopefully we don't run into a situation like we did in September 2013 when we didn't have knowledge of that distributed energy resource and had to shed load. Now, when it comes to the regulation market, which is where in PJM, apart from demand response, the distributed energy resources participate today. Today, battery storage comprises a fair percentage of the behind-the-meter resources registered with PJM to provide regulation service to the grid, about 20% of the behind-the-meter resources. And the operational data that we are privy to shows that behind-the-meter resources in total comprise about 10% of the regulation market. In addition to visibility, situational awareness requires the ability to measure and forecast the operation of resources. So from the PJM, or from the RTO perspective, in an ideal world, the grid operator would have the ability to measure and forecast the amount, timing, and location of all DER, that is, of generation injected into the grid and or load reduced from the grid. Quality granular data would be available to inform grid operators of grid operators' situational awareness. And it wouldn't be necessary to get the data from each individual distributed energy resource or end-use customer, but somehow the data would need to be available to the grid operator in a meaningful, aggregated fashion. The ability to measure and forecast would enhance regional grid operations and least-cost regional dispatch solutions for the regional wholesale market. And in doing so, would lower wholesale prices. Even without getting meter data directly, I should add as kind of a sidebar, PJM has taken steps and will continue to take steps to improve its load forecasting of solar non-dispatchable resources to anticipate appropriate real-time operational actions. Additionally, increasing the transparency of DER locations and operations, as well as of their planned future deployment, would enhance an RTO's ability to factor the operation of these resources into their long-term transmission planning processes. This can result in more efficient transmission expansion plans. On the one hand, DER reduces the load needing to support grid reliability, but on the other, a DER could inject power or reduce load to support grid reliability. Consider, for example, that an energy storage device could be deployed as a transmission asset to mitigate the need for a substation upgrade by peak shaving load at the appropriate location. I can't stress enough the degree of a grid operator's situational awareness need of distributed energy resources, and that it depends upon information flow among the distribution company, the grid operator, and the transmission company. And as the PUCO wrestles with what data and information is needed to advance the Power Forward initiative, We would certainly encourage consideration of what data and information should flow to the RTO to advance the goals of wholesale market efficiency and regional reliability. So finally, we get to what the retail considerations are, having set the context. Well, first, let me focus upon the fact that PJM has been engaged for some time, of course, in evaluating the benefits of distributed energy resources for the bulk power system and our knowledge thereof and treatment thereof, and the regulatory treatment thereof. In January, we established a distributed energy resources subcommittee in our stakeholder process. Its purpose is to investigate and resolve issues and procedures associated with markets, operations, and planning that are related to DERs in accordance with existing or new PJM process protocols. And we'll be engaged, of course, in the near future pursuant to the recent FERC order on electric storage participation in RTO markets, in revising our tariffs to establish a participation model for facilitating the participation of storage resources in RTO markets. And as well, we'll be participating in a FERC technical workshop on April 9th and 10th, dealing with reforms to remove barriers to DER aggregation participation in RTO markets. Those are only the latest chapters, though, in our efforts to accommodate DER in the interest of reliability and market efficiency. In addition to those efforts, we ask for your consideration of the merits of retail policies that incentivize DER performance in the service of grid reliability, including consideration of retail rates that encourage DERs to respond to price signals to provide energy or to reduce load when the bulk power system needs those actions. Federal policymaking indicates there'll be enhanced opportunities for DER and storage to participate directly in organized wholesale markets, such as the ones PJM operates. The PUCO could encourage direct participation in the wholesale market as an avenue for increasing DER storage deployment in Ohio. Not that all DER and storage should participate, but it should have the opportunity to participate, and that could be enhanced through retail rate design. Allowing that direct participation, of course, will increase competition and increase wholesale market efficiency. And there may be opportunities in the future for the development of microgrids in Ohio. And if microgrids are pursued, they may connect to the regional grid in normal operations, but then island in emergency operational situations. When they're not islanded, there may be opportunities for microgrid participation in the wholesale market. PJM is currently involved really in the beginning stages of looking at what that would look like, how metering would need to be configured, how settlements would be handled. And there's at least one utility in PJM that is contemplating this, and so we're needing to consider how to adjust our rules to facilitate that. There may be consideration of how DER storage may provide non-wire solutions. I already mentioned this briefly, to delay or defer wires upgrades that are needed for reliability. If such options are pursued, there may be opportunities to use wholesale market revenue to offset their costs, according to a recent FERC policy statement. And if that's the case, it may be that state commissioners would need to be involved in effectuating rebates to customers of wholesale revenues that are received from DERs that are multi-use, that are transmission in one respect, but generation in another respect. Then as well, and I think really what this panel is getting down to, and it is all about, is there's the coordination and alignment of retail rates and wholesale rates, because that would incentivize the operational performance of DERs to bolster reliability and market efficiency. Wholesale market prices signal when the regional grid needs resources to operate or reduce electric consumption to meet demand as system conditions change. When compensation increases, there's an incentive to produce or to reduce to support grid needs. Now, this doesn't mean that wholesale power prices would need to flow through and replace retail rates for DER. It simply means that retail rates could be aligned. And of course, the whole question here is, what does align mean? But how could they be aligned with wholesale rates? Well, they need to be aligned in such a way that when the temporal reliability needs of the bulk power system change, that rates fluctuate to reflect what those needs are. And retail regulators are familiar with a spectrum of variations on this theme, from time of use rates through critical peak pricing to critical peak rebate, all the way to real-time pricing, dynamic pricing. As the PUCO is well aware, the foundation for wholesale retail pricing alignment is AMI technology. It's capable of sending price signals in time intervals that track wholesale market signals. And Ohio, of course, is one of the leaders in PJM among the states in our footprint in regard to the deployment of AMI. Now, finally, one last comment on net metering. Of course, net metering provides I'll put it this way, a moderate incentive for DER deployment in Ohio. But it would certainly be a large step to move from net metering to fully realizing the benefits of DER for enhancing reliability and bulk power efficiency, and it will require tighter alignment of incentives with wholesale grid operational needs. So, in conclusion, I must stress, these are merely thoughts for your consideration. PJM is not offering specific retail rate recommendations. Our mission is to ensure reliability in a cost-effective manner, and we're interested in gaining greater flexibility, or I should say visibility into DERs and storage, so we may best ensure the system remains reliable, and these new resources can be harnessed to best support system reliability and achieve efficient market dispatch and transmission build-out. And I look forward to your questions, particularly those involving my colleagues here on the panel.
Thank you very much to our panelists. So, Kerry, let me ask you a couple questions. Sure. So, when we talk about the concept of visibility, what is necessary to obtain visibility?
What is necessary to obtain visibility?
So, what would the commission do to effectuate better ease of visibility for PJM?
Well, off the top of my head,
yeah.
I would suggest it would entail imposing requirements to share information, or you voluntarily as a commission with information of the nature of the operational performance of these entities on hand. I'm talking really about distribution level and behind the meter type entities. For you sharing that information with us. Of course, there are all the issues associated, or there may be issues associated with confidentiality and so forth. We need to overcome those kind of issues. But really, it's a matter of going back to my information sharing slide, of sharing the information on hand among distribution companies and the commission and transmission companies and the bulk power operator.
So, but you wouldn't be able to dispatch assets unless they have been aggregated and bid into your wholesale marketplace.
That's exactly correct. I mean, and that's why I mentioned briefly the fact that, of course, that the FERC is now involved and going to be moving forward in a proceeding to examine what the opportunities are for DER aggregation and to make that dispatchable. That was part of the storage proceeding, but then it got split off, and so it's going to be further investigated.
Okay. Well, I think there's some interesting federal state, I wouldn't venture to call it tension, but maybe duplicate, what's that? Interplay. That's a good word.
Right.
That's a good word. There's definitely some federal state interplay there. If you want these resources to be dispatched, if the entities that we regulate are potentially the gatekeepers of that information, not even us. Anyhow, I would certainly
agree with that, Chairman Hawk. I'd agree with that wholeheartedly, and I'm really only pointing out what an ideal world would look like from the bulk power system operator's perspective.
No, but I completely understand your perspective, which is, we've got these resources that could be utilized for the benefit of maintaining a reliable system, and we're clearly gravitating towards a world of less decentralized generation, whether that's market forces or consumer will. So your point is taken. I just didn't know because I've heard that before. I've heard that from NERC also before, who have said, we don't know where these resources are. We need more visibility. Well, okay, what actually does that mean to this body and other colleague bodies in other states? I'm not quite sure, but we'll continue to dialogue about
Very
it.
good.
Yeah, go ahead, Beth.
Just in follow-up to the chairman's question. So after the 2013 load shed event, I know PJM met with individual states to talk about informally information sharing. Was that productive? Did you all get some information about what kind of resources exist that you weren't aware of for
We did.
future? And what, if you done anything with it? I can't remember whatever
Well,
happened.
yeah, what we did with it was to make it available to our grid operators. I mean, we're still in a situation where if in fact there were a situation similar to what happened up in the Pigeon River area in Michigan, we would rely upon the good graces of the local distribution company to help us prevent a load shed. I mean, that was done voluntarily, and I want to point that out again. But nevertheless, for that kind of a purpose and to mitigate an emergency, we have developed a tool that includes information on what we know about the location of these distributed energy resources. And so, yeah, and I'll say again, we work with the Ohio staff, the Ohio Commission staff, who are very helpful in helping us learn about what's available in Ohio, and that was already here, and the staff was aware of it. And so we had an ongoing, 4, 5, 6 month venture to look at that.
Okay, thank you.
Questions from the body? Christina.
Not to prolong this, but when you mentioned kind of operational characteristics, I mean, we know generally, and I think even the EDU knows, where these interconnected facilities are that go through the interconnection process with the EDU. But do you mean actual real-time operations, or do you mean simply capacity factor?
Well, things like that. I mean,
technology
it could
type?
extend to, start time, max and min generation, the kind of things that we receive in the bidding behavior traditionally that we get from entities who bid into our markets.
And then another question, I know there's a lot of unknowns still on kind of what will happen in the marketplace with the aggregation of these resources, but is the preference for the aggregated information to come from the EDC or from a third-party aggregator, or is that still unknown?
I think that's still unknown, and I think that would be one of the questions that the FERC would be exploring in its upcoming proceeding.
Thanks.
Howard?
Just to follow up on that, Kerry, I mean, the model that comes to mind is the model that comes to mind is the CSP, the Conservation Service providers, because they aggregate and they bid in and they basically relay the information on in and take financial responsibility. So is the thinking that there may be something similar for DERs, that they would have a DER aggregator dispatcher?
I think that's among the concepts that are floating around out there, but I really can't speak to PJM's thinking on that as to what it should be. But I think that your point's well taken, that there are models out there, and the CSP is one of those models.
One other thing is unrelated. You have a chart that showed that we had 3.7 gigawatts of DER, and then it's that excluding solar and wind. Do you have any feel for what the solar and wind is?
That's something I can get for you. I'm sure we have a feel for it. The reason that was separated out is because, of course, it's not really dispatchable, as are the numbers that were included in the 3.7 gigawatts.
Okay, so it's intermittent is why it didn't put it on the chart.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question for Maureen. I've had this question I've thought about for a long time, and partly because I am from the rural area of Ohio, and think about in regards to rate making and DERs and the modern grid. How is, remembering, the differences in our population, the differences of the consumer, rich, poor, urban, rural. We're talking about people paying for the services that they receive, or, we're talking about a lot of things, and it's really an exciting period of time that we're talking about. But I don't know whether you've thought about this or the other panel members have thought about how this would affect the different elements of our society.
Thank you for your question, Commissioner Johnson. I think it's an exciting time. I think the Power Forward initiative raises many issues. As you alluded to, there are different needs for different consumers. I was intrigued by the earlier presentation by AEP, where they had suggested a model where customers would opt into certain platforms or certain charges, and that it would be optional. Certainly, that is something that, very interesting concept. I'm not sure how it would work for practical purposes. But I think the one commonality that exists for consumers is consumers want reliable service, and they want service at an affordable price. That's a commonality across all consumers. So that's why we think it's very important, even though it's very exciting and the innovations are out there, it's very important to not lose sight of the fact that you have different customers with different needs, but the commonality being that rates, they need to be able to afford their rates.
I guess as much a comment as a question for Maureen and for Sonny. I was always intrigued by the propensity of this industry to use acronyms, but I didn't realize how alliterative we are, because just today we talked about rates, riders, recovery, and revenue. Now, I want to add two more. It's called risk and reward. And Sonny, in listening to your presentation, I inferred from that a hesitation on the part of you to assume any risk relative to recovery. And Maureen, I inferred from your comments an intolerance to reward for an assumption of any risk whatsoever. So taking a page out of Commissioner Conway's playbook from the previous discussion, is there any common ground? Because as we launched this analysis and this evaluation, the realization, I think, ultimately is that if things are changing, we need to be innovative in how we address and perceive the traditional sense of what it is this commission has done and what we've done as an industry historically.
Gentlemen first, please.
And Kerry can act as the referee in the middle. Courage, Kerry, courage.
So I'll take a shot at responding to that question first. Commissioner Friedman, I appreciate it. So when we think of risk reward, I guess part of my comments are based on the pragmatically, in that we have an approved mechanism in place under our ESP that sets the return on equity. And so part of our caution or being a bit hesitant on moving forward with a risk-reward type construct is that potentially would go, at least immediately, it potentially would go against what's already been approved as part of our package of provisions in our ESP case. And so my comments in regards to additional risk being imposed potentially on the utility, I didn't intend for that to be construed as no risk on the utility's part, because I feel like under the way that we envision it, there are appropriate controls in place. So even though under the way that we view it, we would have a process by which we get approval to move forward with the investments, we would start to spend the money, recover those through the applicable rider, but then all of the costs, kind of the checks and balances, if you will, would be subject to review and audit on an annual basis. And so when we sort of look at the risk and the reward, there is still a risk to the utility as a part of that audit, potentially after the fact. I was more commenting on the notion of once an investment has been approved and placed in service, if there is additional risk or volatility, even though the asset is used and useful and being used to provide service to customers, if there's a chance for risk or volatility on the level of compensation that the utility can earn on that, that was the risk that I think we are concerned about, because that's something that would happen subsequent to approval when the investment decisions are made. But on the back end, we still have the customers, we feel, still have the protection of the annual review of the costs that are recovered through the rider. Does that help?
And I want to comment first, and that's why I wanted to go after Sonny. I want to comment first on some of the points that Sonny made. With riders that are subject to annual reviews and audits and reconciliation, I think there's a big issue here at the commission that it's the elephant in the room. The FirstEnergy decision came down several months ago. I guess it seems like it's been several months, where the court actually put quite a damper on prudence reviews and quite a damper on rate making. The court found that in the FirstEnergy case that the REC credits that the commission had found $43 million was imprudent, found that no matter if the commission found that they were imprudent, that customers would not be able to get a refund for those. So I think it's a fundamental problem with our riders that the commission needs to address, because that definitely just takes away the prudence review and does not allow for the commission to make a finding that a rider is imprudent. So that's a fundamental problem that I think that's not addressed, and is one that goes along with riders. I do think that Commissioner Friedemann, not to be disheartening or inappropriate, I think you perhaps overemphasized our position. Our position really is that performance-based regulation, if it is used, should have certain parameters around it. And if the parameters are proper, those can be used, but it must be used as part, our position is must be used as part of the traditional rate making. So we certainly have seen the commission in the past use performance-based regulation. I don't think it's quite, I don't think it characterized our position correctly to say we are against all performance-based regulation. We believe that it may have a place, but it must be with certain standards and very defined metrics, along with a rate cap for customers.
I didn't mean to imply that you were against any PBR. I was referencing the general intolerance that I inferred from your comments relative to your risk assumption
I think there
tolerance.
is a general intolerance for risk assumption. It is the utility that makes the decision. The customers don't have input into those decisions. They shouldn't take the risks associated with those decisions.
Questions? Dan?
Sonny, I have to say that I got a similar kind of sense from your presentation that Maureen got, which is, and that Commissioner Friedemann got, which is that you're willing to go forward as long as you get pre-approval of the investments, and at some point after the first phase is over, you're willing to recalibrate the direction you go in, but not in a, I didn't get the sense that was a retrospective kind of recalibration, but more of a, next phase kind of recalibration, so that the risk-reward balance that I was hearing from you was really mostly reward, but very little risk for FirstEnergy. And so customers would be bearing the risk that whatever the first phase investment is, if it doesn't turn out the way it's expected, if there aren't the kind of values that are realized that were the basis for green lighting the investment in the first place, that would be on customers, and you might make some adjustments further down the road, but not with regard to the first phase. And I don't know, and I wasn't quite sure what you meant. It's my word is first phase, but you used some kind of a description that at least gave me that impression. I'm not sure what the the scope of that, what I'll call first phase investment, was going to be before there was even a recalibration point. Maureen, to your side of it, I also got the same sense that Commissioner Friedman got, which is that you don't want to move forward with this grid modernization except on the basis of investments made in the traditional manner, or rate recovery for investments accomplished in the traditional manner, which is make the investments, come in, and a year and a half later or 2 years later, whatever the point is after you've made the investments, you find out whether or not return is on the investment is allowed, and what the manner of recovery is going to be. And the difficulty I see with that approach is potentially it discourages in the first instance moving forward. And so I suppose the question for you is, what is your, when I say you, I mean OCC, what is your view of where grid modernization should go? Is it okay with you if we just don't do anything other than what we're currently doing? Or do you think that if investments in AMI, investments in reclosers, investments in Volt-VAR, investments in grid improvements, communication systems, et cetera, that if they aren't made because the method of rate recovery that you say we should be left with doesn't incent that kind of deployment, that's okay, that we're all right with the system we currently have, and these modernization efforts, it's okay with your office if they don't proceed at pace? Or do you think there's some other path forward? Because I frankly see something of a gridlock between your position and FirstEnergy's position, and maybe your position in any of the utilities' positions.
And I appreciate that question. It's a very good question, long question. I think that the position of the office is that certainly the grid modernization initiative is something that should be looked at and could be considered part of the providing customers adequate and reliable distribution service. I would disagree that it cannot be done within the context of a traditional rate case. We've been in this, the commission has been regulating utilities since the early 1900s. We've had grid investment made, we'd have generation investment made. It's all worked perfectly well. This is just another phase of that investment. So I don't accept the premise that if we go to traditional regulation, that this will disincent the utilities and they will no longer be investing in modernizing the grid. And I think, too, it goes along with, it's all within the utility's control. The utility can choose to apply for base rate increase. And then at that point, they can they can seek the recovery of investment, and it can be associated with a performance-based methodology. But I don't think it's correct to view our office as saying we are against power forward, because we are not. We are concerned that it be done in a prudent and steadfast manner, and that it be done through the regulatory mechanism that provides the most protection for customers. And we don't believe the ESP and the rider system does provide the most protection for customers.
But from a rate-making standpoint, what your position is, it sounds to me, is that we should rely upon the traditional 4909 rate base, rate of return, cost of service, rear view mirror, cost of service rate-making approach, and then the next part of my understanding is or maybe it's my misunderstanding, is and if nothing happens, so be it, or if nothing happens, what next?
Well, it's clearly in the...
So we just wait, we just find out whether or not modernization takes place in the under the existing structure minus 4928.
It's clearly in the utility's hands to make to make filings and to build their case for the need to modernize and to show that the modernization is something that is essential to providing utility service and is something that customers want and need. So I believe it's in the hands of the utilities to come forward and present their business plan. And in fact,
Wait a minute, you're talking about presenting their business plans now, Maureen, but I think what you're saying is they have to implement their business plans and then come before us with the business plan and with the investments made. Is that?
yes,
right?
that's
All
what
right.
I'm referring to. I apologize if I misstated. Yes, that is the course that I would see.
And if what happens is, again, we do that and it's, I don't know, business as usual, business has been done for the last 90 years or so, no grid modernization efforts of the type that we've been talking about here, then what? What do? Do we just take it, our conclusion is that's the way it ought to be? Or is it something else that we do?
That's a very good question. It's, that does require some thought.
Yeah, I think, let me just jump in here. I think, unfortunately, Maureen, I think that position is contra to what the national dialogue associated with grid modernization is right now. And so by the nodding heads I'm getting in the crowd, I think there's a relative agreement from the many national experts that we brought in here over the span of a few weeks associated with that. Now, at the same time, let's just sort of drop the veil on the issue, okay? I absolutely understand the fatigue from the Consumers Counsel as well as many others associated with really what has been a very challenging period getting to deregulation. And that's really what the fatigue is associated with. And it's, look, I was just talking to Commissioner Friedman in the back. I mean, so I was sworn in as chair in May of 16, and we're in March of 18, and we're having this extraordinarily robust discussion about grid mod. But in May of 16, I had to deal with navigating PPA remands. Okay, so we're not that far away from having to have gone through that discussion. Okay, and what I want to make sure that the Consumers Counsel and the body at large understands is we get that. Okay, we fully understand sort of the level of fatigue associated with the cycle and the lineage that has taken us to this point where I have affirmatively said, with a couple caveats, we are out of the generation business, okay? So that is not lost on us. I don't think this body up here, and it should be indicated in a number of the questions that we've asked. I don't think this body up here is interested in sort of a concept whereby, and I personally have said this a number of times, that this is not an open treasure chest for the utilities. And part of why we have the discussion about performance-based rate making is because I think there's an acknowledgement that if we are going to evolve in this space, that there has to be some utility skin in the game. Okay, so there's that concept that's being espoused as well. So I understand why the position is being espoused. Yep. My only thought, and I think this is probably Dan's thought too, is that I think just the whether strategic right now to have that position or otherwise, I would just encourage, and part of why we are having this very open dialogue is to really consider whether there are ways other than sort of the ways that are being contemplated right now. And so the position that actually the OCC is espousing right now of what is basically just do your work and then come in and see if the commission would allow for those, would allow for cost recovery associated with those investments because they're prudent. That's a really dangerous spot actually for everybody when you think about it. So I think all of, and I actually just asked Kerry questions because I actually didn't want to get into this. But I think, Maureen, completely your position is understood. Sonny, I think from your guys' position, I think it is a little further away than what we heard from AEP and Dayton as far as this concept of having some skin in the game. It's a little further away from that. So I think probably the answer lies somewhere in the middle. And I've also said this publicly, which is if we really want to advance in the space, the utilities can't have it all. I mean, you can't have every trinket that you apply for, okay, and then also expect grid mod as well. And what I mean by that is, and for this body, for the utilities, for all the stakeholders in the audience, we all have to be much more disciplined in here, okay? It begins there, and we all should collectively be in this together. And you do not have to respond by any means. In all seriousness, I felt like I needed to do this because I felt, I could just sort of sense the dialogue, and I didn't want to leave it without sort of my practical perspective on this, which is, I think that there is. This is an important dialogue to have because it's the start of what I know will be a couple decades long conversation. And from Maureen's side, there is an understood fatigue, and at the same time, you should understand that we understand that fatigue, and that this is not the type of environment where we're going to. Well, I'll just leave it at that. And then on Sonny's side, I think the equation's changing for you guys, and I think you recognize that, but your company specifically is in a unique position, as the commission has acknowledged through its deliberations and discussions associated with DMR. So I don't know that we need to say anything more about it.
All I would say is I agree with everything you just.
Well, thank you, Commissioner. That was very kind of you.
Yes.
Okay. Anything else? Okay. Round of applause. You guys did a wonderful job.
And thank you for the opportunity
Absolutely.
to present remarks on behalf of customers.
Yeah, our pleasure.
On our behalf as well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you,
For
Sonny.
the time and attention.
Thank you, Kerry. Appreciate it very much. Okay, tomorrow we will recommence at 9 a.m. with rate design. Okay, we are adjourned. Thank you very much. Have a great day.